3,000 storage writes, like 6,000 storage reads. You can do pre-compiles, you can do pairing verifications, you can do really crazy complicated stuff inside of an Ethereum transaction, right? Now, actually it's a little known fact that Bitcoin does have this kind of like one quadratic vulnerability, where what you do is you make a transaction that has a really huge number of inputs, and then it has to hash slightly different data that's the size of the whole transaction, but like missing each input each time. So it has to make like n size n hashes, and those can take a long time to verify. But like they have a whole bunch of standard transaction rules and like a much lower capacity limit and all those things that like make that not actually a problem, right? So in the Ethereum case, it just in practice, transactions are big and computation is powerful. Computation can do lots of stuff. And having miners do that kind of computation before even getting paid is not reasonable, right? Like the thing to remember is that as a miner, you're receiving transactions from the public mempool. It's a peer-to-peer network. You do not yet spend any money by putting something in the peer-to-peer network. You only spend money if that transaction gets into a block. So what happens if you could create a transaction which requires doing 10 million gas of computation, and then at the end, oops, you can't put it into a block, right? If someone makes that kind of transaction, then it would just consume a huge amount of computing power of every node in the mempool, or basically DOS the mempool, make it not work, without actually having to pay anything. And so exposing miners to this kind of risk is not reasonable, and which is why verification has to be a much simpler procedure than execution. Now, in early 2015, we actually had really wanted to move people over to multi-sig wallets, right? So this has been a topic that I've really cared about for a long time. Back in 2012, I wrote a Bitcoin magazine article, basically talking about like how the kinds of really crazy situations in which people just totally lose access to their Bitcoin wallets. Like people will just accidentally download a computer virus and poof, 25,000 Bitcoin's gone, right? But here wants to lose 25,000 Bitcoin. But here wants to get 25,000 Bitcoin. Yeah, just like imagine, you get like a little, computer program, like where you make like a little file, and you like title like funny internet meme.png.exe, and then the computer helpfully hides the .exe because it thinks that extensions are bad UX. Send it to your friend, they double click it, the exe runs, and poof, you have 25,000 Bitcoin. So, in 2013, I was pretty heavily shilling multi-sig wallets on Bitcoin Magazine, and I've always been kind of disappointed that they haven't been more mainstream. And in 2015, the thinking was like, let's work really hard to make sure that users' default wallets were not what could actually be smart contracts that have multi-sig logic. So you have 3 different keys, and you would need 2 of them to sign a transaction, right? Like the easiest thing to do, 1 key on your desktop, 1 key on your phone, 3rd is the paper backup, or your friend, or some third-party service, or whatever else, right? Now, the big problem with smart contract wallets is that you would still need to keep some portion of your ETH separately in an externally owned account, right? And that ETH could be, or that account is where the transaction would start. It would call into your multi-sig wallet, and then it would make the multi-sig wallet do things, right? This approach has a lot of disadvantages. It's gas inefficient, keeping a small amount of ETH there, and a bigger amount of ETH here, like making sure they both get topped up. The logic is complicated. What happens if gas prices unexpectedly go very high up, and you don't have any more enough ETH in your ELA anymore? But we figured, like, okay, fine, we'll just push through these difficulties, try to get multi-sigs out the door. Now, the problem was that there wasn't enough time. So, who was in Ethereum here back in 2015? Who remembers being extremely frustrated by us just not being able to get Ethereum out? Okay, see? So, eventually, lots of people were frustrated, right? And at some point, we wanted to, lots of people wanted to, ship it! And, that's, come on, launch it. There were just lots of these very ambitious plans, right, that we had in Ethereum at the beginning. Like, we wanted to do asynchronous calls. We, wanted to add add all kinds of other more complicated features. We wanted to have multiple clients. Like one of our devs really wanted to wait until we had multiple working clients. We actually even ended up giving that up, and the C++ client was like still kind of in alpha mode when we launched. And you know, like that idea just never had enough time, right? And so Ethereum launched, and there was no practical way to have a multi-sig wallet. And the over-optimism on multi-sigs actually even backfired, right? There's this, like basically, one of the mechanism that Ethereum uses to kind of let applications know that some important event inside of a smart contract has happened is called a log, right? And the log, it's a log opcode, it creates an object called receipt, and that receipt goes into a Merkle tree, which is separate from the state, and this can be easily accessed by clients, it can be verified by light clients, and all of these things, right? Now, the way that we designed every smart contract wallet, and even ERC20 tokens, is that it issues a log every time it's sent. Now, ETH transfers were never logged. Why? Because, well, at the time when we decided this, we thought people would be using multi-sigs. The problem is, almost nobody did. Almost everybody used single signature, right? Like EOA wallets. And so exchanges ended up not checking logs, they ended up checking transactions. And so what actually happened is that multi-sigs had a harder time getting their deposits accepted by exchanges, right? So, a bit of an unfortunate story. The dream of getting everybody to use actually secure wallets had to wait another year, maybe another 7 years. So the first part of the journey here is EIP 86, right? This is the very first attempted EIP that would try to do account abstraction. It was for Metropolis, which was meant to be the hard fork after Homestead, so the second hard fork after launch. That ended up not happening. But the basic idea is that it's this like a small change where if the signature of a transaction is set to 0, then the sender address would be set to this account that we call the entry point account, which is 2 to the 160 minus 1, right? Which is 0x so, you know, about 40 Fs here. Clearly, you know, gave many Fs at the time. So we set the, and then there was also another feature that was added where you could have what's called counterfactual smart contract addresses, right? Basically, the way that this worked is you could have an address where that address is calculated as the hash of the piece of code that would go to that address, go into that address when it gets created. Now, why is this important, right? The reason why this is important is because it's really important for UX purposes for it to be possible to generate an address where that address has the property that there's only one piece of code that can go into that address, and that piece of code can definitely go into that address, and no other code can go into that address. Now, why, right? Basically because it's like, how do you receive your first transaction, right? Like, let's say you join Ethereum for the first time, right? And let's say that somebody wants to send you 1 ETH because they're feeling nice and it's your lucky day that day, right? How do you do that? Well, you have to like give them an address, right? And with EOAs, they can send you that 1 ETH and you're fine. But what if you're using a smart contract wallet? The problem is, if you want to act, like, before you have that 1 ETH, before you've actually interacted with the Ethereum ecosystem and received any payments, you don't actually have a way to put smart contracts on chain, right? Like you don't have the ability to do anything. And so all you can do is you can do off-chain computation, right? And if you do off-chain computation, generate an address, and then give someone that address, like if you could try to generate the address that you will have when you can create that account. But then, like, that account actually has to be locked to that particular piece of code, right? Because otherwise, like, someone else can swoop in and they can say, haha, I'm putting in my private keys instead. And, you know, you don't want them to be able to do that, right? So having a version of the create opcode where the address actually is the hash of the code is super important. So these were the two big things that we wanted to put into the AP86. Now, the big challenge with account abstraction is not actually the consensus side, it's actually the miner strategy side, right? Like, how do miners behave if they want to safely decide which transactions to accept and which transactions to reject. So the initial thinking here was there were three different ideas, right? One of these ideas is to have a whitelist of code hashes, right? So there would be a list of code hashes of accounts that we would accept. And this could be the code hashes for multi-sig wallets, single signature wallets, some extra signature algorithms, one quantum proof signature algorithm. You could like select a list of options that we know are safe. And then miners would just have a whitelist. And you can expand that whitelist over time without hard forks. Miners could expand the whitelist even independently. And miners would accept transactions going to accounts that pass that whitelist. And accounts that are in that whitelist would have the property that they're known to actually pay the miner before doing anything else, right? So that's strategy one. Strategy two is basically to stick to small transactions, right? To process transactions that ask for, let's say, less than 250,000 gas. Right now, this really constrains the kind of things that you could use Ethereum for, right? So, like, if the limit actually was 250,000 gas, then Tornado Cash would not work, Starkware would not work, publishing your own contract would not work, unless there was an exception for the gas that was used to publish the contract. A lot of things would not work, right? Big transactions had that. And so, like, these two ideas, they were not extremely nice, and even still, it ended up missing a lot of things, right? So problems with early AA, right? So one is this issue that I mentioned, that like counterfactual addresses, right? If you're going to send me one ETH, then like basically I have to first ask you to create my account for me and then send that one ETH to that account, right? Confusing workflow. It requires complex logic inside the accounts to handle payments and refunds, right? So the contract itself has to have logic that says, step one, compute the signature hash by taking the call data, taking out the signature, hashing it. Step two, check the signature. Step three, check the nonce. If the nonce is correct, increment the nonce. Step four, pay the person who paid the miner. Then step five, do the thing that the account was supposed to do, like either calling to another account, or if you want to do multiple operations, then you'd actually have to like do a call into yourself, and then inside of that call, you'd have to do other things, so that if whatever logic you're doing internally ends up breaking, it only breaks the inner call, it doesn't break the other call. And then finally, at the end, you have to do like some extra accounting and figure out how much gas you have not spent, and then get that gas refunded, right? So account logic actually gets pretty complex, and any code that's written could potentially have bugs, and so this is bad. Finally, transaction hashes are not unique, right? So lots of Ethereum infrastructure relies on this idea that a transaction with particular hash can only appear on a chain once, right? Etherscan relies on this, the Geth API relies on this, or the Ethereum API, lots of infrastructure totally relies on this, right? And early AA basically has this problem that like it lets the user specify so much that if the user wanted to, they could, for example, make an account where the nonce resets every 24 hours. And if you do that, then well, guess what? The transactions that were sent 24 hours ago can be replayed, and you could basically have a transaction happen every day that has the exact same hash, right? So this breaks a bunch of UI features. One big problem that we actually did not properly appreciate even now is that, and this is probably the big problem, this is like half the reason why AA has to be hard, right? Multi-validation. Basically, imagine on-chain, you have an object on the left. That object is called S, and it contains a storage values. It starts off at 0. Now imagine you have an account, and the logic of the account says, when it accepts a transaction, it does a bunch of computation, and then after that computation, it checks whether or not the value stored inside of S is 0. If it is not, then the transaction fails. And if yes, then the transaction passes. Now, imagine you have 1,000 accounts that are all like this that have the exact same rules. Now, imagine transactions like this get into the mempool. the miners would check these transactions. They all individually look like they can get in, right? And so they all individually pass. They all individually get broadcasted. And then whoever sends those transactions suddenly sends in a quick transaction, very higher gas price, only 30,000 gas, where all that it does is it calls into S and it sets the value in S to 1. Suddenly, one tiny transaction is able to invalidate an unlimited number of big transactions. Even if the verification process has a tight gas limit, so instead of 2 million, it might be 200,000, even then, this is like a really huge amount of work that you're imposing on the entire network for ultimately a very small cost that you actually have to pay, right? Now, let's get to 2017. Who here remembers 2017? Who here remembers, like, the digital kitties? This was like, this is good. This is before we got the monkeys. Like, the kitties were cool, right? Can we, like, retcon the kitties into, like, actually being the honorable one before people started the stupid monkey stuff? Okay. So, in 2017, lots of Ethereum research started happening, right? And this was also the time when Casper FG was being worked on, a lot of big progress on proof of stake, a lot of progress on sharding. Some of the earliest data availability sampling work actually happened here. But okay, so first, these is like a bunch of account extraction ideas that were being worked on at the time. So one, remove nonce abstraction. So basically, force the nonce to still be done in the protocol and incremented in the protocol. If you do that, then that removes the whole multi-hash thing. It basically forces every transaction to have a unique hash. Standardize the signature scheme, basically take a bunch of the work involved in like calculating the signature hash and verifying the signature and sort of put it up into the protocol to make wallet code smaller. Add a breakpoint opcode. So this is like a really subtle point, right? But basically the idea here is that we add this opcode called breakpoint such that if execution gets past the breakpoint and then something breaks after the breakpoint, it doesn't revert everything. It only reverts back to the breakpoint. Now, why do we need to do this? Well, before the breakpoint, you put verification and then you pay the miner. After the breakpoint, you can put whatever. And if the whatever breaks, it only goes back to the breakpoint, and so the miner still gets paid. Right? So it makes it much more flexible to have like different kinds of templates. Other ideas. Salt and code in each transaction. So the idea here is basically that you could have each transaction that performs the task of creating an account and calling from that account at the same time. Right? So this whole problem of like what does an account extraction user do during their first transaction just kind of gets solved automatically within the protocol. And if it's their first transaction, then the account gets created. If it's a later transaction, it already exists, so that's fine. Then a newly account created account pays, right? So if you do the salt and code thing, then the accounts that actually gets created, that's the account whose ETH is actually used to pay for gas, right? And so if you have that, then, well, when I'm receiving my 1 ETH for the first time, like, I don't need someone else to pay for gas for me, right? It just gets paid directly from my account. And then there's a subcode called pay gas, which would basically cover the entire gas payment procedure. So the initial payments, doing the whole logic of like the base fee, the priority fee, but also keeping track of the gas used and doing the refunds at the end. Everything we can put into one opcode, right? Having a gas price opcode, we ended up actually doing that. So a lot of different ideas, right? The primary goals: 1, handle the account creation problem; 2, reduce the verification complexity, reduce the complexity of the account code, deal with the problem of hash non-uniqueness, but there has been not yet any thinking on dealing with multi-invalidation. So, 2018, so verification time access restriction, right? This was this very first post. I believe this one sent ETH research. Basically, this is where we finally had some kind of solution to multi-invalidation. And the solution was kind of copied from this idea called access lists that we invented as a way to try to make the EVM more parallelizable. But in this case, the basic idea is the verification part of each transaction would not be allowed to access any account except for that account itself, right? So you could access your own storage, you cannot access other people's storage. Now, what is the goal of this? The goal of this is to allow, or make sure that a transaction from account X can only be invalidated by another successful transaction from account X, right? So you cannot multi-invalidate. One transaction getting in can only invalidate other stuff from that same account. So that seems to fix it. Now, somehow we skipped over to 2020, right? And there was this like period of like 2020 minus 2018. I'm not good at math. Anyone here have the answer there? How many years? Okay, right, it's 5. So 5 years, right? Where basically I think developers were just basically EIP 2938. The contents of which basically are an actually sensible combination of all of this stuff. So the pros of 2938 are it solves some problems. The cons are it's very complex at the protocol layer. At the time when, still for another 2 years, developers would be working hard on the merge. September 13th, 2020, another 2 years actually, exactly 2 years. Now, at the time, there were also these independently built account abstraction projects, right? So, Gas Station Network was this wonderful effort where basically you would send over some like operation that you wanted, like some call that you wanted to make, and you would provide a bounty. And there would be this network of relayers where any of those relayers could claim the bounty by putting your like that call into wrapping in a transaction and actually making the call. Now, this is a good effort. And something very similar was done by Argent Wallet, which was the team very early on, doing account abstraction before account abstraction was cool. And this kind of works, right? But the two biggest problems are like one is it's like these are not really enough of an open market, right? In that like there were links to like basically to use these things you had to like call into a specific place, right? Whereas what we really want is for it to be okay for something level, anyone can right? So all work with wrapper transactions. There was also another goal that was introduced, the goal of making it possible to pay transaction fees. You want to be able to spend your USDC and so enter the C in the app. Problems was not being enough of an open market. It's also a high per transaction. I do not really think of it as being account abstraction because modern account abstraction actually tries to cover that with 3074. So even there so different goals. Basically sponsored transactions, people being able to pay on the other on behalf of other people, application developers being able to pay on behalf of their users, and being able to pay with your C20s. And another big one is multiple apps per transaction, right? So one example of this is so Cohere has traded ERC20s on this level. So Cohere remembers like that experience where like first you have to make a transaction to unlock the token, and then you have to like send a separate transaction to actually do the trade. Cohere allowance of infinity is something and then didn't recommend that thing. It has happened, right? So like this is like now Cohere has done all of this in the dark days before EIP 1559, when transactions would often take like 5 hours to get on chain. And so you'd have to like wait 5+ minutes to finish the whole thing. Good. You see, like that last problem with 1559 and with the merge reducing variance of block size has fortunately been like actually fixed, right? But the other problems are still there. So that's that aspect of UX, like letting people do many operations within one transaction, is like also super important. Now, ta-da, 2021, ERC 4337. There is an ongoing holy war about whether or not ERCs are EIPs. My personal opinion is that it would be better if there were two separate categories, but other people have their own opinions that they would fight and die for, which is totally fine. But basically, 4327 tries to do roughly the same thing as 2938, but instead of being a protocol feature, it does it using 0 Ethereum protocol changes all on higher layers, right? So the basic workflow is you have a bundler, and the bundler collects many user operations from a public mempool, which is so a peer-to-peer network, right? Anyone can send things into a peer-to-peer network, anyone can be the bundler, they can collect it, and then they would make a transaction that wraps all the user operations, and then the transaction would go to an entry point contract. The entry point contract would then, first, it would call the check and pay function of each and every one of the wallets, and then if those checks pass, it would call the executed refund function, right? So the key innovation here is, one, this entry point contract mechanism. This idea that instead of putting every operation into a separate app where you could put many operations into a single using the MEV early ecosystem to create an open relay market, right? So block workflow where first and then others and then finally and that will verify what final transaction will find out, right? For execution to mechanism interfere with verification. That's basically makes the system check the safer over a user, like sponsorship for. Two is in Ethereum long term, but this is like the most basic example, right? Basically, today, every transaction has ECDSA signature in EOA, 65 bytes, right? You have your VRS value. And that's a lot of data, right? So if you look at the top there, that's a present day transaction, and a signature is like a big part of it. And then if you do a compression, then on a signature becomes an even bigger part of it, right? And this is especially important for layer 2 protocols, because on a layer 2 protocol, computation is done off-chain, and so computation is much cheaper, but data has to go on-chain, and so data is just as expensive as before. Signatures are big. They are 65 bytes. Data is 65 gas, or 16 gas per byte. 16 times 65, 1040 gas. Oh, wait, I'm supposed to be that bad at math, sorry. Okay, 3084 gas, there we go. So 3084 gas, it's basic per block, or per transaction in layer 2, right? And, yeah, it's like a lot, right? If we're trying to do like thousands of transactions a second, it's kind of hard, right? So, basically, if we want rollups to be like really high scalability, we have to compress data. The problem with signatures is that they're cryptographic, so they're basically random data, and so they're basically impossible to compress on their own. But what if we have aggregation algorithms that replace the collection of signatures with one big signature that attests to all signatures, so like the correctness of all the other signatures, right? So BLS signatures actually support this. You can take a very large number of BLS signatures, combine them, and you create one signature of the same size that can be used to verify all of the operations, and basically verify everything at the same time, right? So what this ERC-4327 extension does is it lets you actually provide aggregators, and it lets you actually aggregate all of these operations together, right? So we get really nice efficiency gains for layer 2s, so that on layer 2s, this 4327 can actually be more efficient and less costly than regular ECDSA operations. So that's kind of the history, right? It's this kind of set of ideas that sort of move forward from being very early thinking that kind of tried to solve these problems but did not really get anywhere, and then slow improvement, lots of slow improvement over time, and it kind of got to roughly where we are today, right? And I think the good news news is like we've like lots of people are using smart contract wallets already, right? Like who here is using a Gnosis Safe? Or sorry, I just forgot. The trademark department is telling me I'm not allowed to call it a Gnosis Safe. It's supposed to be called a safe with a TM and superscript. Who here is using a safe? Okay, so lots of people are using a safe. I'm using a safe, right? So it's it's a big concept. So multi-sigs are good, and more and more people are using them, which is excellent, right? But like we want to get to a future where multi-sigs become easy and multi-sigs become default for users, and more account security in other ways becomes a default for users. And when the time comes to react to quantum computers, we will actually users will individually be able to upgrade their keys to something else to be quantum safe without needing to actually replace their account, right? This was actually one of the other big reasons why we wanted to do account abstraction, so that we could have a nice, easy migration path to quantum safety that doesn't require the protocol itself to do anything when the time comes. Now, more recently, the pendulum is actually kind of swinging back toward enshrining more things, right? So, one of the reasons why we struggled with account abstraction at the very beginning is because there was this dream of like making the protocol really nice and pure, right? What we really wanted to see is we wanted to see a world where a transaction call and a contract-to-contract call would be the exact same thing, right? It's like a block would just be a top-level call, and then every transaction would also just be a top-level call. Now, the problem is that we just kept on finding all of these different ways to improve things by enshrining. And even in the context of ERC 4337, right? There's entry point contract risk, which is, the entry point has been audited quite a bit. It's getting increasingly heavily audited, but even still, there is the desire to try to improve efficiency, to try to reduce the gas overhead at 4337. Also, there's this like anti-censorship issue where, like, Ethereum earlier this year, there was that big scare where for a short period of time, 75% of like certain specific types of transactions are through the builder market, though fortunately that ended up improving a lot since then. But the challenge for making the MEV market safe long-term against censorship, like we've had these ideas, right? But inclusion lists operate on a transaction-by-transaction basis. And so to make inclusion lists actually benefit account abstraction users, the inclusion list would have to also be something that applies to account abstraction user operations in addition to EOH transactions, right? So that basically, even for that reason, account abstraction needs to be enshrined. Account abstraction needs to go on layer 2s. We need standardization, integration into existing wallets, integration into existing tech, just like all kinds of integration into stuff, right? Like, currently I think there is this really big problem where a lot of dApps end up being, like, not even just EOA-centric, but like MetaMask-centric, right? I remember when I was setting up my Gnosis Safe for the first time, which I'm allowed to call that because back then it still was called Gnosis Safe. I remember I was able to go through the flow using MetaMask, but I was not able to go through the flow using the status wallet. And that actually later on ended up being fixed, right? It turns out there's subtle differences between MetaMask and Status and Brave, and lots of application developers, unfortunately, end up not even doing basic checks against wallets other than MetaMask, right? And this is just something that needs to change, and the ecosystem needs to do a better job of incentivizing to change. And account abstraction wallets, also have similar challenges, right? There are applications that try to do transaction crafting locally within their own JavaScript, and if you do that, then that ends up failing. There are some NFT applications that try to use the code being 0 as a proxy for the user being a person, and they ban contracts for participating. And this, of course, also breaks account abstraction. There's a lot of applications that don't support, ERC 1271, ERC 6492, like basically things that try to extend the idea of off-chain signatures to account abstracted wallets. We also need to do a better job of extending the encryption to account abstracted wallets, and that's another big one, right? There's just lots of these like standardization things that need to be done, but if we do, then it does look like we're on a pretty good path to making account abstraction default in a few years, and having a much safer path to like usable, secure wallets and a whole bunch of other good things for people. So thank you.
Alright, before we start the next session, so I will play our theme song again, and please the panelists for the next session, please get prepared at the stage. Thank you.